I came across something just recently that we know that the Elohim is known, we've discussed it endless times over. Elohim, the appellation for God with Elohim, is the attribute of din, midas hadin. What is din? Din itself is exactness, exact judgment. The world was created with midas hadin, with the attribute of justice. I always used to ask, the attribute of justice is how do you evaluate a person? To a judgment. So if a person is evaluated and the judgment is exacting, the person would not survive. Because since man is far from perfect and we're prone to fail, every time we somehow go out of the frame of exactness, we get zapped, we get zinged. God reigns in on us because Elohim is exactness. Midas hadin means the midas harachmim, the attribute of mercy is Hashem is willing to be tolerant. It doesn't mean to say that the record is going to be ignored. It means ultimately God will give you chances to make corrections on that record, whether it's tshuva, to repent, whether God will dole it out over a lifetime, rather than incapacitating you at one moment, to give you every opportunity, every chance to continuously advance your spiritual capacity, to address your spiritual potential. That's the concept of midas harachmim. That's the attribute of mercy. So it's not in contradiction to midas hadin. Midas hadin means exactness, immediate, with immediacy. Rachmim means it's not with immediacy, but ultimately, if the record is not corrected, the person carries the full brunt and full responsibility for that record, which may be negative. Now, nature in Hebrew is called Teva. Teva means nature. That's the natural order. Ha-Teva means the nature, Ha-Teva and Elohim are the same numerical value, is 86. Teva and Din and Elohim is the same numerical value. What does that say? Now let's understand. Why did God originally create the world with the attribute of justice? What does that mean? Until day 6, man didn't come onto the scene. Let there be light. Let the upper waters separate from lower waters. Let there be vegetation. Let the waters. What does that have to do with the attribute of judgment? What it means that in existence, there's nothing superfluous. Everything is exact. Every aspect, all the parameters, the extent of existence, whether it's celestial, terrestrial, whatever it is, why the heavenly bodies are what they are, why the sun has that intensity of heat and gases, whatever it's made up of. Everything is with an exactness. It's that way because that's what it has to be. It cannot be different. Cannot be different than it is. That's exactness. So what is Teva? What is nature? Nature is exactness. It is that way because that's the way God created it. That's exactness. But if the yardstick and the profile of existence is exactness, and man is part of creation, that means man himself has to be evaluated with that same exactness. That becomes a problem. Because if the evaluation of man, because if the objective of creation is man should make choices, and he's not going to make the right choices, and he's not exactly as he's meant to be, what happens? God will, to reset the balance, to reset the exactness, man has to be what? Has to be compromised, which is called punishment. Because that is nature. If nature is Elohim, then man cannot survive. Because since man is prone to fail, because he has choice, and judgment means exactness. You have to walk that straight line. So whatever it takes to walk that straight line, God's going to make it happen. But if God makes it happen, what happens to the human being? He's fully compromised and he can't function. And there's not a chance he's going to meet his potential. So what does God do? God somehow expands it a little bit for the sake of man. What's for the sake of man? It's doled out over a lifetime. God holds it in abeyance and he stays the judgment. But ultimately, if the human being does not make the correction and continues, ultimately, divine retribution is going to take place, whether in the physical world or in the spiritual world. It's going to happen. But what is nature? Nature itself came about through Elohim. What's Yud Kei Vav Kei? The appellation of was, is, and is in the future. What does that represent? That represents infinity. God is an infinite being. The concept that God is able to override the system is because he is the source of the system. What is the basis for Teva, for nature? The basis for nature is God himself. So as he created the system to be exact, if he chooses, the system should not be bound to exactness. It doesn't function exact. It doesn't have to be exact for that reason. So Teva is Elohim. Chesed. Chesed is not within the context of judgment. Not immediacy, not immediate judgment or prolonged judgment. That's chesed. There's a concept which is discussed in the Mishnah that God does everything or deals with the world or humanity, mida connected mida, measure for measure. Now, what's measure for measure? An example of measure for measure is who took the remains of Yosef out of Egypt? Moshe. He was the greatest Jew who ever lived. And due to his removal of Yosef's remains, they were buried in Shechem, in Canaan. So because Moshe had done that, who buried Moshe Rabbeinu? Nobody knows the burial location of Moshe. God buried Moshe. Because Moshe himself buried, Moshe, the greatest Jew, buried Yosef. He attended to all his burial needs. So therefore, God attended to all the burial needs of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's measure for measure. One of the attributes of mercy is over al pesha. God is willing to look away. What does that mean, you're willing to look away? So the Chofetz Chaim explains, a person has a claim against another Jew, and he's willing not to make the claim or not to collect the full debt. He's willing to let it go. If you're willing to let it go, regarding your fellow human being, God's willing to let it go. God is willing to let it go. An example, so Chofetz Chaim explains, the Rambam rules in the laws of Tshuva, how does one classify a tzaddik? The classification of a tzaddik is if the majority of his accomplishments are meritorious, and the minority are negative. Now, who is able to make the evaluation of what majority, what minority is? So he explains, the Rambam, that this evaluation is not quantitative, but it's qualitative. And the only one who's able to make this qualitative evaluation is only God himself. Because he says you find sometimes you could have one mitzvah, which is the equivalent of many mitzvahs, or one sin is so grave, it's the equivalent of many sins. So although quantitatively it's one sin, but qualitatively, that would be considered the majority of the person's behavior is classified as negative. But only God can make that evaluation. So let's say a person, after God's evaluation, the majority is positive. If the majority is positive, the classification of that person is tzaddik. Classified as a devoutly righteous person. But this devoutly righteous person, when he deals with people with an exactness. As they say, he demands a pound of flesh. He wants it down to the last ounce because he has a right. So if that's the way you deal with people, when God evaluates your record, it's going to be evaluated with exactness. Exactness. What's exactness? Person does a mitzvah, and it's lacking in qualitatively. It's lacking. He did it with an ulterior motive. He did not do it for the sake of God. He did it with a level of distraction. He did not do it with reverence and with love. And he has a background, an education. He knows better. If that's the case, if you evaluate it based on majority versus minority, it's majority. But if God puts it under the microscope and says, by the way, this mitzvah is considered deficient. Therefore, I'm going to give it a C evaluation. And the sin may be a minority, but you should have known better. So therefore, the sin is marked as if it's something which is, it's magnified. So you say to God, well, but why be so picky? Why be so exacting? You know why? Because that falls under the classification of measure for measure. As you're exacting with your fellow Jew, God will be exacting with you. But let's say you're not exacting with your fellow Jew. It's okay, I will let go. Somebody offends you, and you say, no, it's not the end of the world, let it go. I'm willing to forgive, even though he doesn't deserve to be forgiven. I'll let it go. If your behavior pattern is to let things go and not be demanding, not be exacting, when God will make an evaluation of you, he will not be exacting and that demanding. And as resulted, the end result will be that although your merits are deficient, and maybe they should not be evaluated as positive, fully positive, God will classify them as fully positive. Because that's the way you evaluated and you interacted with your fellow Jew, your fellow human being. This is the Chavetz Chaim. So he says, the Chavetz Chaim, if a person assumes this approach to life, that you're always willing to let go, that will be your entry ticket into the world to come. Why? Because as long as you know you're doing the right thing, even though we're far from perfect, but factually, even though it's lacking qualitatively, but that will be overlooked. Because as you overlooked it, God will overlook it. This is the attribute of overall passion. God is willing to overlook the defiance because you do. Okay? That's the Chavetz Chaim. If somebody puts a pin into you, what do you say? You say, ouch. That's called a natural reaction. I told the story about Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zechat Tzaddik Livrocha, that Rav Moshe, when he was older, he had a driver, and the driver would pick him up at his home, and it was normally about a 15-minute walk from his house to where his yeshiva was. And the driver was not a married person. He was old already, and he was a person who was a little off. And this person's whole life was given value because he was chosen to be Rabbi Feinstein's personal driver. And he prided himself. The whole world knew, whatever his name was, he's Rabbi Feinstein's personal driver. Rav Moshe Feinstein, an older person, as he got older, an older person, when he gets into a car, he just doesn't get into the car, just slips in. Very often you have to hold on to the frame of the car and lower yourself into the car. This driver didn't realize Rav Moshe Feinstein's hand was on the frame of the car, and as he's lowering himself into the car, slams the door on Rav Moshe Feinstein's fingers. Now, if Rav Moshe Feinstein would have screamed out of pain, you know what he would have done to this person? This person would have to been medicated and sent to an insane asylum. He wouldn't be able to, he would have had a meltdown. He would have had a nervous breakdown. Rav Moshe understood that. Do you know what it means It happened with such suddenness, Rav Moshe Feinstein did not utter a sound. Understanding the consequence of expressing any level of pain, how it would destroy this person. What does that take? It takes superhuman strength. It takes a level of sensitivity to be considerate beyond our imagination what being considerate is. You know what that is? That's not natural. That's called unnatural. And his whole life he lived an unnatural life. Who ever heard of not sleeping 8-7 hours at night? He was up every morning, 2 a.m, studying till the morning, reviewed endlessly, put himself out for everyone. Who ever heard of anything like this? I told over the story. Somebody called from Israel to ask a question, a halachic question, and he didn't realize the time difference. And it was 3:00 a.m. in New York, and the phone rings, and Rabbi Feinstein is woken up. He answers the phone, and the person says, "I'm calling to ask you a halachic question." And the person at that moment realized that he woke up Rabbi Feinstein. And the person says, "I'll call back. I made a mistake. I didn't realize the time difference." Rabbi says, "No, just wait 1 moment. I'll be right with you." What did he do? He went, washed his hands. He said the blessings before you study Torah. So it took him about 5 minutes to get back on the phone. This is in the 50s, where a phone call long distance from Israel maybe could cost you $8 for just a few minutes on that phone. So Rav Moshe Feinstein speaks to him. He gets back in 5 minutes later. He asks him his halachic query, gives him the answer. So Rav Moshe, when he finishes the conversation, says, "Could you please give me your address? Give me your name and give me your address." So he figured maybe he wants to record, put it in writing exactly what the ruling was, to send it to him. So he gave him his name, he gave him his address, fine. A few weeks pass, the person receives a check in the mail for the cost of the phone call that Rav Moshe delayed him 5 minutes longer on this phone call, that he caused him that loss of money. You know what this is? You're calling me to have with a halachic question. I'm going to answer. You make a mistake, you wake me up in the middle of the night. You want the answer. Because Rav Moshe felt he kept him on the phone for 5 minutes longer to be able to answer him, although it was for the other person's best interest. He had to underwrite that cost. And he sent him a check for that additional minutes, those additional minutes that he spoke to him. You tell me, this is natural? This is a superhuman being. This is unnatural. When you live a life of unnatural, you know what you merit? You merit that God deals with you supernaturally. Naturally, you dealt with nature. You put your hand in the fire, you get burnt. You walk down the street, you don't merit miracles. But a person who lives an unnatural life, God deals with him unnaturally. It was known, there was a person, he was a Rosh Hashiva in Telz, passed away in the early 60s. His name was Ramotel Katz. And he had a very bad heart. And the doctors, and he studied and he lectured publicly, said public lectures, Talmudic discourses, and he was engaged 15, 18 hours a day. And the cardiologist couldn't understand a man with such a weak heart. How's he able to actually be so active, be solely fully invested? It's not normal. So the doc afterwards, when he passed away, he was in his 70s, mid-70s. And the doctor said, "Do you know how the rabbi lived so many years?" Because his whole life was never a natural life. This is the doctor. I'm not sure if doctor was a Jew or not Jew. Didn't live a natural life. He lived abnormally. A normal person doesn't live the way he lived. To invest his life in what he invested in. Everybody, what do you invest your life in? In your glory, in your material, in your acknowledgement. That's what you do. That's natural. For that, God's not giving you extra years, and God's not going to shore up the system to indulge to a greater degree. But if you live unnaturally, which is spiritual, which is unnatural. Naturally, we're not spiritual. And you make the effort and meet the challenges, which most people fail. That means you're a supernatural person. You're out of the realm of natural. It's not Elokim. This is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. We find by Moshe Rabbeinu, when he asked God, when they withdrew the straw subsidy, he came with a complaint against God. Why did you causing such problems for the Jewish people? Since I've come, things have gotten worse. It's not better. God says, woe to the patriarchs that they're no longer found people like that. They never questioned me. You, I revealed to you the meaning of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. I gave you an understanding of what the infinite is. They have no understanding, and you're the one who asked the question. So what does Yud-Kei Vav-Kei represent? The source of all the miracles, the plagues that were brought in Egypt are rooted in Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. That's the supernatural. So a person who lives a life of nature, natural, that's Teva, same numerical value as Elokim. The one who's willing to be Mavra Midosov, let it go, let it go. That person is not synonymous with Elokim, with judgment. God is willing to evaluate his case differently. It's a different type of evaluation. Avraham Avinu was not a natural person. Who ever heard? Life is everything. I will not bow to the idol, I'll go into the kiln. But you have so many more years you could live. But to live, and the whole world of pagans. And Avraham being a no-ide, he had no obligation to sanctify God's name. Why do it? Because I will not live a lie. I will not compromise my standard of truth. I prefer to die. This is something, you want to call it abnormal. It's out of the ordinary. It's not within the context of nature. It's not finite. If that's the case, how does God deal with it? Performs a miracle, takes him out of the kiln. The Midrash tells us that if a person gives his life knowing he's going to die, there's a chance he can merit a miracle. But a person initially puts himself in a precarious position, believing God will perform a miracle for that person, God will not perform the miracle for him. Because you're expecting God to do it. If you're expecting God to do it, that's easy. That's natural to behave that way. So you go in. So Avram went into the kiln not to come out of the kiln. He had a brother, Haran. When he went into the kiln, why did he go into the kiln? Because if his brother came out of the kiln, he believes he's coming out of the kiln. But you know what happened? He went in, he didn't come out. Because since he only went in, and to him, it's natural to come out. If that's the case, you don't merit the supernatural. You go in, you don't come out. You don't merit that miracle. So a person who lives a life, you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your possessions. You're willing to give it all away. What is the value of that? Your love should be that your love of God supersedes the love for yourself. You're willing to be destitute, penniless, if I have to violate the word of God. That's with all your possessions. I'm endowed with genius, with ability, with creativity. Where do I invest it in? In the Torah, an ancient text, which the world sees it as primitive and backward. And you couldn't care less what the world thinks. I do what God wants. But you realize you're not going to be the most popular person on the block. It's irrelevant. What is that? That's not called natural behavior. That's out of the ordinary behavior. Other people see it as abnormal behavior. But how does God see it? This is out of ordinary behavior. That's exceptional behavior. If you behave out of the realm of the natural, God treats you in that realm as supernatural. God will provide for you. Differently, he provides for other people. Therefore, your predicament is different. Avraham Avinu, when he came out of the kiln and he confirmed that he's not bound to the natural, I will die rather than be a pagan, although I don't believe in it. God says, now it's ready. Now you be the founding father of the Jewish people. Lech lecha me'artzecha. So what was the impetus? What was the launching pad for Avram? So it's very interesting. There's a whole question I mentioned. What was the first test? Was the Kazdim coming out of the kiln, or going to the kiln, or going to the land that I will show you? But we're explaining it now. Even though going to the kiln may have been a test, but that test was only a test to determine whether Avram will be the founding patriarch of the Jewish people. Once he came out of the kiln, you've proven yourself. Once you've proven yourself, now you're qualified to begin ascending that ladder. And the 10 rungs you have to ascend. You start at one level, the ultimate culminates with the Akedah. That's the 10th rung. And once you hit number 10, then you're part of eternity. You're here forever. Eternity goes beyond the supernatural. Supernatural is within nature. Eternity goes beyond existence. So once he reached 10, which is the 10th, so really the first of the tests, when it says Hashem Nisus Avram with 10 tests, the first test of Abraham was what? Was Lech Lecha. Was the test of the Orchestra? It was a test. But that test was the prerequisite to establish Avram, whether he qualifies to ascend the rungs. I'll give you an example. Person has to take an entrance exam to see if he's going to go to an Ivy League college, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, whatever it is. And you take the exam, you pass. You understand? You could pass that exam, but if you don't get a passing grade on the courses, they're going to flunk you out. They're not going to keep you there. But it's understood. You have to study for that exam to be allowed to enter into the university. Lahavdil Elef Abdolis. Avram, to be qualified to make the ascent, he had to first go into the kiln. Now I understand who you are. Now you're ready to meet the challenges. What are the challenges? 1 through 10. It starts with Lech Lecha. So we're not minimizing the Ur Kasdim, but it's not one of the 10 challenges. And that's why the Rambam and Rabbi Yonah don't count Ur Kasdim as one of the 10 tests. It started with Lech Lecha and it culminated with the Akedah. God gave Abraham incentives. Leave your homeland, your birthplace, your family, your father's household. The Eschol Godol, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will give you renown, which is simple understanding. And you will be a blessing. So one of the interpretations of Rashi is that I will make you into a nation. Right now, Avram was barren. He had no children. Meaning you'll have a child, and from that child, ultimately, you'll be a great nation, like the stars of the heaven. Let's understand. Avram Avinu was one individual. The hay that was added to his name was the same letter that God created existence. There's a verse in Tehillim where David HaMelech says, "B'kol Hashem tzur alomim." With the letters Yud Hey, God created the worlds. Which worlds? The physical world and the spiritual world. The spiritual world was created with the spirituality in the letter Yud. The physical world was created with the spirituality letter Hey. God said to Avram, for you to be qualified to father the patriarch of the eternal people, I have to recreate existence that you should be the equivalent of all existence. That's the reason why Avram had the hey added to his name. It wasn't just a label. It was an indication of a metamorphosis within Avram that it was equivalent of all existence. That's Agad Lo Shmecho. I will magnify your name. The name itself will put you on another plane. You're the equivalent of existence. Why was Avram able to take on the world single-handedly? Why? Because he himself, when he came out of that kiln, what does it say? Atohu Hashem Elokim Shehotzeiso Avram Yurkastim V'samta Shemo Avraham. Because he came out of the kiln, you designated his name as Avram. He didn't have to become Avram right away. But he really, the trajectory of Avram was already there the moment he came out of that kiln. This is Agad Lo Shmecho. Ultimately, where are you going to arrive? You'll be at a level that you're going to father a child that is going to be the equivalent of all existence. And that's why through Yitzchak, we became that great nation. In the history of the world, the Jews were never the equivalent of the stars of the heaven. What are we talking about? Quantitative or qualitative? It's qualitative. The Mishnah tells us if you save the life of a Jew, it's like you saved the whole world. What do you mean save the whole world? It's one individual. The world of billions of people. The innate value of a Jew, which we have no understanding, you cannot fathom, only God knows that, has greater value than the whole world combined. That's Eschol Godel. But how did that happen? Because the Jew is part of Avraham. We were a new creation with the equivalent of all existence. As a result of Avram, when he was on this trajectory to ultimately father that patriarch, which is Yitzchak, when he became Avraham, he took on the world single-handedly. And he had the ability. You know, it's interesting. You have a young person. You have a person who's a very successful, well-weathered businessman. And he sees potential, appreciates that. He sees this young man just came out of business school, and he says, this young man, it pays to invest in him. Why? Because someday, the way I see it, he's going to be a rainmaker, even suppressing myself. It's a worthwhile investment. Avram Avinu, when he came out of that kiln, God says, it's more than a worthwhile investment. Ultimately, this man, at the age of 99, is going to reach the pinnacle of his spirituality, and therefore he's going to father the future patriarch of the Jewish people, and he's going to be worthy to have that letter added to his name that the metamorphosis should take place at that moment. The same thing. That's Escho L'Goy Goder. It was due to Agad Lo Shmecho. He was able to father that great nation, which qualitatively is more than the world, was because Agad Lo Shmecho. Because I added to your name. We find that when Avram was told that he was going to have a son at the age of 99, the Torah tells us, Vayamein. Avram believed. And the Torah tells us, because he believed that God was going to give him a son, it was considered righteousness. Why? Because originally Avram had said, Avram was an expert astrologer. The star said, Avram ein lo ben. Avram's not meant to have a son. So God says to Avram, Avram ein lo ben. Avraham yesh lo ben. Abraham will not have a son, but Abraham will have a son. When God tells him this, he believes it, and it says that he believed it, it was considered righteousness. So the Ramban asks a question. A person who never experienced a miracle, you could say, God says, I will perform a miracle. It's not so simple. You know, conceptually, you can believe something. When you're coming to deal with the reality, it's not simple to accept it. But Avram Avinu already experienced the miracle. Avram was thrown into a kiln, which no human being ever survived, and he came out. So now God says, although the stars say Avram will not have a son, and when you have the name change, you will have a son, why is that considered so special to believe in that? That's the question of the Ramban. You go and you invest with a fund manager. He's made fortunes for people. And the person says, as I made fortunes for them, I will make fortunes for you. You can believe it because he has a track record. He's made fortunes. But a person, it seems to me he has the ability to make fortunes, but he's never proven himself. And he says, I will make fortunes for you like I'm going to try to make fortunes for others. You understand? I'm going to give you just a small amount of money. I'm not taking a chance. Because you're not a proven entity. Avram already, God's a proven entity with God. He was in the fire, out of the fire. So why believing now he's going to have the son? Why is that such a great accomplishment that he believed God? And since he believed, that was considered righteousness. That's the Ramban's kasha. Nachmanides asked this question. So the morale of Prague is something profound, phenomenal. Now, what's the difference between the terrestrial level and the celestial level? Terrestrially speaking, what happens? You plant something. It grows. And to a point, it's ready to be picked. What happens after a while? Whatever you pick or whatever grows ultimately withers. When it reaches its maximum potential, it starts waning and eventually withers and dies. So what is the physical world? What is the terrestrial level? The terrestrial level is its aspects, continuous aspects of change. You have seasons. You have fall, winter, spring, summer. What happens after summer is over? The world is in a decline physically. So there's always flux. There's always transition. So what's the difference between natural transition and miracle transition? It's just a more extreme level of transition. Before it was this, now it's something else. But it's change. On the celestial level, there's never change. The moon is the moon, the sun is the sun, the rotation of the earth is the rotation of the earth. No change. So in astrology, when you read the stars, and the stars say Avram will not have a child, that's etched in stone. Nothing, that's never been changed. On the terrestrial level, I wanted the fire could come out of the fire. Because that's the location of change. Miracle. On the heavenly level, there's no change. God says, Avram will not have a son. Avraham will have a son. So that Avram was able to believe, even in an area which there was never change, ever, that's called righteousness. And God considered that you believe, it's considered something very special. Because regardless of what you experience, that has no relevance to what you're believing at this moment. That's the understanding. But part of that believing is what? It's believing something which is equivalent of an impossibility. What does that mean? I'm not locked into the box, as they say. I'm outside of the box. And therefore, the Gemara tells us, Talmud tells us, Ein Mazel Yisrael, that a Jew is able to change whatever the zodiac says, what his predicament is, through extensive tefillah, prayer, and merit, we could change whatever the stars say. A non-Jew cannot change that. A Jew can change that. Why? Because the Jew himself, in his essence, is not limited to nature. We are an eternal people. We have that ability to be eternal. If you're that special Jew, and that's where you live in the ordinary life, but if you live a life, as we said, the supernatural life, the unnatural life, not naturally, and you have merit, that merit could change what is natural. The zodiac is natural. You're able to supersede the zodiac and evade it. And whatever it says doesn't mean anything. It doesn't necessarily apply to you. That's Ein Mazel Yisrael. The Jewish people are not bound to the mazel. Of course, we have a mazel. We'll have a star. You say mazel tov when a child is born. But if God forbid a person wants to change it because it's not so great, you're able to change it, but only if you're worthy, which you need tremendous merit and tremendous prayer to make that change. That's agad l'shmecha. V'yei bracha. And because of that, people seeing that and understand if you are, when they're going to want to bless their children, everybody's going to use you as the model of that special person. You should be like Abraham. Because everything that he identifies with is something positive and out of the ordinary in the positive sense. Now, many years ago, the world has changed in terms of the Jewish community. In the 50s, even people who were so-called observant Jews, what was the hope and prayer for 99% of observant Jews? This is post-World War II. Before World War II, there was a depression. People could barely make ends meet. People had to work on Shabbos, and it was a tremendous challenge not to go to work. And they went from job to job every Sunday. They had the weeks they had no employment. So what did they want for their children? An education. You should have a means of livelihood, a source of livelihood. That was the emphasis. The whole idea of dedicating your life to Torah study was unheard of. Because the question was, how are you going to earn a living? That's what they used to ask. How are you going to earn a living? Okay. But many people, it was a very small number, they committed themselves. And today, there are many people who study. But in those years, it was a real sacrifice. But what did a boy was bar mitzvah. What was the blessing they used to give? And I'm not exaggerating this. When they would write, they would give a $25 bond, which cost them $18.75. That's what you would give. The bar mitzvah gift very often was in a little envelope from the bank. You bought it, $25 bond, $18.75. Signed it. Mazel tov. You should be as rich as Rockefeller. That was the blessing they would give to the bar mitzvah boy. That's the ultimate. The goal is be as rich as Rockefeller. Today, maybe they'll say Bezos, they'll say Gates. I'm not sure who they'll say. Maybe they'll say Putin. I'm not sure. One time they used to say the Sultan of Brunei. He was the richest man in the world. Oh, they said many things in the past. You should be as rich as Rockefeller. And what's that all about? You'll ask which one? John D? Is it other Rockefeller? Is that why you live a life? That's an objective. That's an aspiration. Agad lo shmecha. What is our pedigree? What is our legacy? A legacy is you supersede the natural. The Jew surpasses the natural. Jew is eternal. Rockefeller is not eternal. Nobody's eternal except the Jewish people if you meet the grade at some minimal level. This is the blessing God gave to Avram because he met the 10 challenges. And every Jew has the DNA of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I always mention, it says in the Chazal, what should be the aspiration of every Jew? Mosai Yagir Masai Lamasa Avosai Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. When will my accomplishments be as great as my patriarchs, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? That should be the aspiration of every Jew. That is the goalpost. So they ask a question. What about you want to be as great as Hillel Hazokin, Hillel the Elder? Be as great as the Rambam. Nothing less than the patriarchs. What do we say? Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. So what we always say is, every one of us don't necessarily have relevance to Hillel Hazokin, Hillel the Elder. He was from the tribe of Judah. His DNA was a DNA of Judean DNA, spiritually speaking. Every one of us, we came from different tribes. That was our DNA. But the totality of the DNA, who is it? It's the DNA, spiritual DNA of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And every one of us possess it. Therefore, if our aspiration is to be as great as them, we have relevance to whatever they were. At some level, we have relevance to what they were. Therefore, a Jew has to understand who they were. If you understand who they were, and then you have a little inkling of what the DNA, what their potential was actualized, we have infinitesimal relevance to that, but we have relevance to that actualization of that DNA. Therefore, it's Moshe Yagim Masa Masa Avos Avmitz of Yaakov. Therefore, that should be the aspiration of every Jew. Nothing less than that. Moshe Rabbeinu was a unique Jew, but he was individual. He was not the totality of the Jewish people. The patriarchs are the totality. And if we're part of that totality, we have that same potential to a degree to be able to achieve a semblance of something. Therefore, understanding that, that's what we have to go for. And therefore, that should be your aspiration.